This morning's scripture reading will be taken from Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 31. Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 31. I passed by the field of the sluggard, and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down.
Good morning. We do have a number that are visiting with us. We are very thankful that you are here. We'll get back to Proverbs in just a minute. You may be thinking that John read the wrong verses, but that is not the case. What is interesting about Proverbs 24, which we'll see in just a minute, is the next verse, and that's what I really want to focus on. I want to thank Tyler always, but certainly the last couple of weeks as I was out of town and stepping up in responsibility of things that normally two of us do, and so I certainly appreciate that. And ask you to remember Jacob. Jacob is leaving for Colorado for a month, starting Tuesday, and he's going to be preaching out there, so ask you to remember him as he is doing that. He'll be preaching tonight. If you would, please come back and worship God with us once again. After studying the book of Isaiah and seeing more and more of the fact that every generation or every person that has ever walked the face of the earth is really, really, really similar. We're all the same. The struggles that come up may look a little different. Technology changes, but we don't change. The issues that you see today in this world have been issues since the beginning. The majority of them go back to the fact that we're just selfish beings. We want to do what we want to do. And obviously that brings in a lot of struggles, especially when we all want to do what we want to do and it's not the same thing. It is amazing to consider all the different generations that are around. George Orwell once said, every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. And that's shocking to me because I just assumed you all understood that the Generation X was the wisest and the most intelligent. Because that's what I am. Unless I'm not, then I change that, I suppose. But you think about your generation, and you look before us, and you think, wow, it's amazing what they missed. Why are they so upset about certain things? Or you see this new generation, and it's a shock that they don't have all the answers, and they're striving to find answers, and we look at them like, what is going on with this generation? And that's the exact same thing the generation before us did to us. It's amazing how often something that is said by man can also be read in the scriptures. And you can see how clear it is and how so often we view generations to generations, first of all, as a whole, which is a dangerous thing anyway. But we miss the value that we have of these other generations. We miss the zeal of the new generation. We miss the wisdom of the older generation, that every single day we lose more and more of that generation. And we have the opportunity and the ability to ask them questions and get the wisdom that comes from them. And the opportunity to teach the next generation instead of just complaining about the next generation, as every single generation seems to do. Ecclesiastes, the first chapter, beginning in verse 9, and as I said, we'll get back to Proverbs in just a second. But it says these words, again, talking about from a bigger perspective, things on this earth, the natural things and how they all continue. But you certainly can make the application when we think about the other things in our lives. He says, what has been, it is what will be. And what has been done, it's what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see this? It is new. It has already existed for ages, which were before us. There is no remembrance of the earlier things, and the later things as well, which will occur. There is no remembrance of them among those who are still to come later. You think about that perspective. It's amazing to me to think about the wind as an example. It's the same thing that Solomon would have dealt with at his time. The nature that goes on around us, they would have seen it all just like we do. But the interesting principle to me is when we apply this to generations. We all carry around now a small computer that happens to answer phone calls. Back in my day, I'm just kidding. The older generation invented that. God bless you that you took it all and made it into one thing. That's great, I guess. But they're called smartphones, not wise phones. There's a huge difference in what they do. Just because we have Google at the palm of our hand is not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. Quite frankly, it can be both. And we need to understand the power that there is of talking to one another and getting information and wisdom and knowledge from one another and applying it to the next generation. The more, again, as I said, as I read Isaiah and Jeremiah, the more that I see this is the issue. I want you to think about the verses that were read in Proverbs, the 24th chapter. So Proverbs 24, verse 30 and 31 seem very obvious. I passed by a field of a lazy one, and by the vineyard of a person lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with weeds. Its surface was covered with weeds, and its stone wall was broken down. You think, wow, that's a sad-looking area. I've been by some of those places. Verse 32, though, is the point of this. When I saw, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. See, that's the problem. So often we see things, but we don't learn from them. We see them. We see the issues that are going on in the world. We can complain about the issues that are going on in the world, or we can learn from them and how to help people through them. Obviously and ultimately, that's Jesus Christ. But it's understanding the opportunity that there is to learn from the things that we go through in this life and that we see in this life. It's not just simply, as he's talking about here, seeing a field of a lazy person or a vineyard that was just overgrown with weeds. You can see this in marriages. Albert Dixon, when I was working with him, that's what he would talk about from a marriage standpoint. There are people who have a marriage and it's like a garden. You can take care of that garden every single day. You can take the weeds out, or you can let it be overgrown, and it's going to take over. And you see this time and time again. What I can learn, or what we can learn from that, is how I can make sure that my garden is taken care of, if you will. It's not just simply seeing what other people do. It's the application. It's the learning of it. It's seeing when reading what we read in the scriptures and learning about our God and what he has done for us. One of the things I love about science, but first of all, God is the God of science. The theories are nonsense most of the time, but he's the God of science. We understand all that he has done. So the more things that they find, do you know what it shows? A creator. Keep going out and checking out his creation throughout the universe, because you know what you're going to find? A God. You see his creation. You see what he has done. You see the intelligence of his design. And we see who we are. We need to see things, but we need to learn from them. Over in Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, this is the Song of Moses, as it's called. But Moses says something that I think is so important, and there's two sides of this. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 7 says, "Remember the days of old, consider the years of all generations. Ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. So you have a part of this that's very much a personal thing. I have to remember. I have to be willing to see it. We sang the song this morning about great is thy faithfulness. It's a beautiful song. It's even more beautiful when you understand that Jeremiah talks about that in Lamentations, the 3rd chapter, when he's going through horrible difficulties, and he says, great is your faithfulness. I remember what you have done. Great is your faithfulness. Therefore, I have hope. It's the importance of understanding the purpose of the songs we sing, the things that we go through, and the opportunities that are around us to ask other people. We need to remember what God has done for us. The easiest way to describe how people view God most of the time is, what are you going to do for me next? Perspective. We kind of forget some of the things that he has done for us in the past. You are here because of his grace. And we need to make sure we understand what he has done for us. We are blessed to live in this country. Blessed. You can complain about it. We are blessed to be here. We need to understand the blessings that we have and see them as they help us through difficulties. But we also need to make sure that we ask other people, that we talk to the older generation. I read a quote, I shared it on Facebook, that talked about how there's a lot of times these new generations come up and we take away the fences that the older generations put there without ever asking why they were put there. And so you take down these fences, these things that we're trying to help protect, and we never think about why they were there. We've got to ask. We need to learn from the past. And a lot of people talk about it every generation. We need to do it. We need to learn from it. As Jeremiah will talk about, it's learning the ancient past. It's learning God's way. It's seeing what he has done. And it's being willing to ask. The other difficulty that comes in verse 7, and we certainly see this in the New Testament, is older people way too often do not want to tell. We need to be very mindful that there are things that you have, no matter your age, to pass on to the next generation. Way too often it's older women thinking that I'm not old enough yet to tell other people, you are. You are. Way too often it's younger people thinking that they're too wise to learn anything from somebody that lived a long time ago. That's absurd. We need to understand how blessed we are to be surrounded by people with various walks of life that are all united in Jesus Christ, and how we can help one another and lean on one another. But if I'm not willing to teach it or tell people about it, and I'm not willing to ask and to learn from it, it profits nothing. We need to make sure that we are asking. We need to make sure that we are learning. In Romans, the 15th chapter, this is exactly the purpose of the law, or the things that were written earlier times, the Old Testament. It says in verse 4, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." It's not simply written for you to read and have the knowledge. What is it supposed to do? It gives us hope. Hope. We learn of our God, we see what he has done, and the things that are written are not just simply an academic learning process. It's to give us hope. We grow as God's children. We learn how God took care of his people in the Old Testament. We learn how all the sins that we see around us today are not new. And I can read them in the Scriptures. We learn how he handled them, how he expects us to handle things. And how God is still with his people throughout all the things that they go through. And we can find perseverance, we find encouragement, and we have hope because of our God. It's going back to Proverbs, the 24th chapter and verse 32, the verse that we talked about earlier. It's seeing the things, but learning from them. Learning them. Applying them. How can we do better? How can we learn from what others have done? Generation after generation after generation comes along and they view other people this way. You may say that you don't specifically. That's fine. But generation after generation after generation thinks that they are smarter and certainly can look down on the generation that's here now. Instead of understanding the opportunity that we have to teach, the opportunity that we have to teach them how to handle things and to learn from them and to learn from the past. We talked about in the high school class, we were talking about various things. Some of your kids like English. There's their favorite subject. Some of you need to do better. You just need to do better as parents. But there are some that like history. I like history. Andrew likes English. He was the other teacher, so that's the inside joke for the class. But you think about history and learning from history. It's one thing to know it. It's one thing to be so good at Jeopardy. I know the answers. That's not wisdom. That's not learning how to use it and apply it in situations. I can read 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, and if you turn there with me, 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, we can read these things. And it's talking about how we're supposed to learn from them or avoid Israel's mistakes. And the things that we can read, whether it's in Romans, the 1st chapter, or whether it's here in 1 Corinthians 10, can be written about every generation today or that's ever lived. This is what people struggle with. My people, God's people, need to learn not to, or how to struggle with them, how to get over them or overcome them. That's the struggle. So in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, we're told about this. You begin in verse 1. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our fathers who are under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea, and they all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from the spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. You stop there for just a second. All of them went through this. All of them saw this. All of them saw the great blessings of our God. Verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for their dead bodies were spread out into the wilderness. All of them saw it. All of them passed through it. All of them saw God's blessings. Most of them were not well-pleasing to God. Do we learn from that? That's the question for all of us. He goes on in verse 6, and that's what he says. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they indeed craved them. What's the example for us? You need to see the spiritual blessings. You have to see them, or your eyes are going to drift to the pleasures of this world. And they begin to crave them, rather than seeing the spiritual food, seeing all that God has done for them, and learning how to get through the things that he talks about here. What's the first one he talks about here? Do not be idolaters. You may not have a gold statue in your house that you bow down to, though some people in this world do. They certainly did in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But you certainly may have a box in your house that you watch nonstop, and it's your priority that you put before God. And you may watch a show on there called American Idol, which, it's in the title. We have things in this life that we put before God. And so you can hear the word idolatry and think, oh, that's Old Testament. That's old people would do that. Older generations would do that. We do that. If you're putting something before God, in essence having reverence for it, whether it's money, sports, whether it's in television, whatever it is, hobbies that we have, whatever they are, if we're putting them before God, there's an issue. That's why the book of 1 John ends by saying, watch out for the idols. Watch out for the things of this world. Watch out for the things that you can make as your priority over what God offers. You know what else is not new? Sexual immorality. This has been an issue from the beginning. In verse 8, he says, "Nor are we to commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day." And I encourage you to go read the Old Testament about these things. Numbers as an example. This isn't new. This wasn't only a Sodom and Gomorrah issue. This wasn't only a Corinth issue. This wasn't only a Roman issue. This is a human issue that people get caught up in various situations and commit sexual immorality. That's not new. Why does that happen? Because you take God off the pedestal. You take him off his throne. And we begin to do things that we want to do. Tyler and I did a podcast this week that's coming out tomorrow that'll be talking about Romans, the first chapter, and this subject that people struggle with, that has become a hot button issue in our time today. But it's not new. And the answers of what God says haven't changed. We need to understand or learn how to stay away from them and how to help other people. They need to see Jesus Christ. They need to understand who he is. There are people that test the Lord, as he goes on, and he'll talk about that in verse 9. "Nor are we to put the Lord to the test, as some of them did, and were killed by the snakes." People were testing God. Why should we listen to Moses? You said you were bringing us out to a land flowing with milk and honey. We're not there. Why are we here? Time and time and time again, they test God. Where's the water? Why do we always have to have this kind of food? They test him. You know who else does that? Or at least is tempted to do that? We are. This idea that there is no God that people will try to say today is not a new thing. The scriptures will tell us how to answer that. All you have to do is open your eyes, and you will see him in all the things that are around us. We are made, as Ecclesiastes says, as eternal beings for eternity. Our desire is to have a relationship with our God. What happens is that people learn not to have that relationship. We need to make sure we're teaching people how to have that relationship. Tell them about Jesus. Talk to them about who he is. But this is kind of where we get caught up. You may not be caught up with idolatry or sexual immorality or putting God to the test. But in verse 10 he says, "Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroyer." You may not call it grumbling or murmuring. In a very tame way, you can call it complaining. The world is surrounded by negativity. And God's people are tempted to take that in and begin to do the same. That's not what we're called to be. We're called to be more in this world than just people that are acting like everybody else, complaining about every single thing. We're going to look at Philippians, the 2nd chapter, in just a minute. We're called to be lights in this world, to be stars, as the word would be. We are called to shine bright. We are different. And if you find yourself acting just like every single other person in this world, I strongly encourage you to consider your relationship with God. We need to learn from the past. We need to learn that this is not a new thing. We need to learn and take this as an example of what is going to happen. As he goes on in verse 11, "Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, until whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let the one who thinks he stands watch out that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you except something common to mankind, and God is faithful, so he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." We need to understand that these things are written for our instruction, for our learning. And And I'm not sure that's the way that we view the scriptures sometimes. We don't read about David and Goliath in this amazing story just to teach our children about David and Goliath in this amazing story. We're supposed to learn something from that story. Maybe we learn I'm a little too much like Saul, or I'm a little too much like the soldiers. Or maybe we learn that, you know what, I'm going to continue to grow my faith and be more like David. And I pray that we all learn how awesome our God is in those stories. And how that same God is my God. And is with us in all that we do, if we're willing to have a relationship with him. Avoid the mistakes that you read of in the scriptures. Avoid the mistakes that other people have done. Learn from them. Just don't point them out. Learn from them. We are blessed in so many different ways to have people around us that are able to help us through so many different things. You know, it's been years ago now. When I brought up the fact that I struggle with anxiety, it was amazing to find out I wasn't alone in that. It's amazing how often you think you struggle with something, and other people do as well. We're just afraid to talk about it sometimes. We're surrounded by people that can help. And the roadblock sometimes is the fact we don't think that other people will understand. I may not understand specifics of the things that you struggle with or the things that you're going through, but I can tell you, I understand who can help you. I know the one who is able to help you. We have to be willing to help one another. We have to be willing to listen to one another. And do all we can to learn and continue to shine bright. As Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verse 14 and 15 will talk about. He says, don't grumble. Don't complain. Shine bright. Keep shining. You're caught in a perverse generation. It was in the first century as well. Keep shining. It's the same thing today. I pray that we all make the most of the people that are around us. You know, one of the things that is so difficult looking back, I do this from time to time as I get older, are the people that I wish were still here that I could ask questions about. And I wish I could talk to them. And I know everybody feels that way. The only thing that we can control, though, is talking to the people that are here now. And not wishing we can have an opportunity to talk to them later. Talk to them now. Learn from them. Encourage them. Older people, please be willing to talk. Talk to the younger. Younger, be willing to listen and learn. Then we are acting and being so much like the family that God wants us to be as our head, and then as the body, encouraging one another, helping one another. If you do not have a relationship with God, you have the opportunity now. I pray that you do learn from other people. All have seen God's blessings, God's creation. We've all experienced God. But not everybody's going to accept him as their Father. Will you? Will I? If we can help you with that, we would love that opportunity. Do not wait. If you have questions, ask. We simply are striving to have the relationship with him so that we can be in heaven and be there together. Do not wait. If there's anything that we can do for you, I ask you to please come as we stand.